Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, 2020 Vision into Your Cloud Security. This is a very unique session. We are going to have two parts to this session. In the first part, we are going to interview Maurice Stebila, who is the CISO for HARMAN International. And on the second part of this webinar, we invited Ralph Buckrop, our customer from RWE Supply and Trading, to talk about his experience with cloud security and with the Tufin solution specifically. So thank you all for joining me today. And hello, Maurice. Hello, Ralph. Thank you for joining me.
And good afternoon. Thank you. Exciting being here today.
Hello, Maya.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, so we are ready to start with this webinar, and I'm going to start by introducing Maurice. So Maurice is a Chief Information Security and Compliance Officer within the global manufacturing and financial services industry with over 25 years of extensive information security, Sarbanes-Oxley, compliance management, risk management, and business continuity experience, overseeing cross-functional teams in the development and implementation of high-performance global information systems and services. As a certified information security systems professional, Maurice provides executive guidance to some of the world's largest enterprises, including EDS, HP, General Motors, and most recently, HARMAN International. Maurice is the author of multiple security awareness programs and information protection newsletters, and was presenting in the latest RSA conference in San Francisco. So, Maurice, thank you for joining us today. We invited you to answer a few questions about cloud adoption based on your insight and experience. And we're going to start with a question about the challenges. What are the primary challenges that CISOs need to address as they move their organization to the cloud?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here. So as a CISO for a Fortune 500 company, we face a variety of challenges. I would say that the biggest challenge as we start to move off-prem and into the cloud, whether that be a private cloud or a public cloud, is really the governance of the data. So when I say governance, I'm talking about the availability, the usability, integrity, the security of your data. So first of all, where is your data being stored? Do you have the visibility into all the various cloud services that your company might be using, whether that be Box, Dropbox, AWS, Azure. And to gain that visibility, many large companies will invest in a cloud access security broker, also known as a CASB, which is used to identify cloud services. One of my favorite cloud security brokers is a company called SkyHigh, and it will provide you that visibility into just how many cloud services are you using. Next, of course, what type of data are you storing and potentially sharing with your third-party providers? Are you storing critical data? Is it your intellectual property that's in the cloud? Who has access to that data and who can control that access? What I find is that many large companies may already be in the cloud. I mean, they have thousands of employees who potentially have created their own personal work-related cloud storage or collaboration accounts. And these private accounts, they're not federated, back into your Active Directory system. So it really leaves company data exposed and outside of your reach to control. so that when these individuals end up leaving the company, they end up taking their data with them. So this is a huge concern. From a compliance perspective, you also have to remember that when you're moving your on-premise data into the cloud, the protection of that data is still your responsibility. So think of the cloud as a business tool. The compliance rules and the regulations, they don't get transferred to the cloud provider. They're still your responsibility. Trying to think what else here. You also need to understand the type of data that you're storing. PCI, SOX, HIPAA, PII, and what other regulatory requirements for that data. These legal and regulatory requirements, they're not going to be static. They're going to be changing. I mean, just recently, we have a lot of discussion about the new European General Data Protection Regulation, also known as GDPR, that's becoming effective next year. With these new regulations, you're going to have additional regional specific regulations that you need to understand. And then lastly, the management of multiple systems, potentially across multiple cloud service providers. As the network becomes more complex and more vulnerable, you're going to need to have a solution in place to orchestrate all your security configurations and policies across both public and private cloud service providers.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Maurice. And so, based on what you were saying and based on what we're seeing as well, we see that sometimes security teams are not always involved in the decision to adopt cloud services and the decision on how to configure them. What has been your experience with that, and what do you think security leaders should be doing to address this?
Well, you're absolutely right. In many cases, most of the cloud service providers and services that are taking place within large corporations are done through what I'm going to call shadow IT. But at the same time, shadow IT can be very beneficial to the business. Cloud adoption is very important. When you think of software as a service and being able to use the latest versions of applications needed to run the business, those are all made available to your customers using the cloud. Using the cloud, you can do more with less. With cloud computing, companies can reduce the size of their own data centers, even sometimes eliminating their whole data center footprint altogether. So with cloud, you've got flexibility in cost. Some services are pay as you need. They're always on availability. You have improved mobility, improved collaboration. So cloud services can be very cost effective. Expenses can be reduced fairly quickly. Here at HARMAN, I've even seen our cloud services reduce the integration time necessary when we're doing either a merger or an acquisition. But all these great benefits, you still have a number of new security challenges that come along with them. You have lost what used to be your data center perimeter. And now you have a new perimeter with borders that are very difficult and sometimes impossible to identify. The visibility is really the starting point. As I mentioned before, having a CASB solution to first identify what cloud services are being used is critical. But just as critical is having a single pane of glass which can manage and control your security configurations and policies associated with each of those cloud services. That's actually what makes the two-fin security policy orchestrator so important, in that you need a solution that is able to identify and control both sanctioned and unsanctioned services. And I can guarantee you that the unsanctioned list of cloud services is probably going to be much larger than what's already been sanctioned by your IT department.
That's important, and we'll get back to that single console, single pane of glass. But I do want to drill down into the visibility that you mentioned. You mentioned several aspects of visibility, like which cloud services are in use and who has access. Do you also see challenges in visibility of cloud infrastructure security configurations that are changing, like new instances that are coming up, their tagging and security group configuration? And if you do, how do you suggest or recommend addressing these?
Yeah, so you're correct. Visibility is really the common theme here. When, first of all, choosing a cloud service provider, you need to understand what service has a greater risk than another. Has a particular cloud service that I'm looking at been breached in the last 6 months? Do they encrypt my data at rest? Is it encrypted in transit? Have their systems been recently patched, to address what I'll call high-profile vulnerabilities like Heartbleed or Poodle? I suggest when it comes to visibility, having a risk ranking for each cloud service that will then help you identify what additional security services you may want to employ, whether those be data loss prevention tools or an additional web applications firewall. In many cases, a good CASB solution will also be able to provide you that risk ranking. But also, as we talk about visibility, we're also looking at the visibility into the cloud infrastructure security configurations. So as the network really becomes more complex, it can become almost impossible to manage a consistent security posture across multiple networks, both internal, external, hybrid. So most networks actually end up having inconsistent security policies and configurations, which I can tell you firsthand end up being identified later on as a control deficiency in your next audit, and that's one thing that you don't want to have. So as discussed before, you really need a solution that's going to be able to manage what I'm going to call the enterprise network, the entire landscape, something that's going to be able to manage it when it comes to designing your network changes, assessing your risk, and being able to do that consistently through a single pane of glass.
That's what we see as well, the inconsistencies, and that leads me to the next question. So after you gain visibility and you realize that there is inconsistency, how do you gain control? So how do you control security configurations in the cloud today, and what are some of the best practices that you would recommend to other security leaders?
Well, in terms of gaining control, as we sort of mentioned, you've got to gain control first by what cloud service you're going to use in the first place. So you need to identify and associate a risk score to each of your potential cloud services. But then you need a solution that will, in fact, orchestrate across all of your network security infrastructure, hybrid, private, across all cloud service providers. Without that, as I mentioned previously, you're going to end up with a insecure, inconsistent environment. And I think of, some best practices that really need to be implemented as you're moving into this direction. So one is you need to develop I guess what I'll call a holistic data protection strategy, something that's end-to-end protection. And that's going to require a very detailed snapshot of your network. It's going to be vital to truly assess all your cloud service providers so that you have a full understanding of what aspects of network security fall within their domain and which fall within your responsibility. You're also going to need to define, what's important. I had read once that that more than 2/3 of IT security practitioners say that their organizations fail to proactively assess the types of information or the types of data that are being stored in the cloud. And in many cases, that data might be too sensitive, so defining the types of data in use and prescribing the appropriate measures for each type of data is going to be an important best practice. You also need to make sure what I'll call closing the loop, right? Cloud security is only as strong as its weakest link. And so you have to remember that as people come in and out of the corporation, revoking access credentials is very important for former employees. And that becomes more difficult as you move into the cloud because, as I mentioned before, unless you have an enterprise agreement with some of these large service providers, AWS, Azure, Box, Dropbox, there are hundreds of them, actually thousands, and unless you have an enterprise contract with those providers, many of your employees may have their own personal accounts. And by having that, those personal accounts are typically not federated with your Active Directory. And it's very difficult then to close that loop because when they leave the corporation, they still have access to that data and they're taking your data with them. A couple more best practices I can think of is really getting buy-in whenever you're moving into the cloud. Make sure that you've got your C++ and in some cases, maybe even buy-in from the board of directors involved as you talk about and inform them of what your data security strategy is going to be. You're going to want to continue to monitor your cloud activities. Stay up to date on these threats. And that's proactive monitoring, looking at the organization through a single pane of glass, if you can, so that you can quickly spot any inconsistencies when it comes to the configurations, any vulnerabilities, and by identifying these and patching them, you're going to be able to improve your incident and response time, especially if you're breached. And then I think last but not least, it's training. You can't forget about training. Even the most robust security guidelines, they're not going to be helpful no matter how much documentation you have unless they become part of the employee's everyday procedures. So training is so important. You need to clearly communicate this to all employees.
Yeah, and going back to what you said about data and knowing what data is stored in the cloud and who has access to that data and whether or not employees who should be revoked are still accessing the data, I want to go into compliance. And regarding compliance, you mentioned before that cloud adoption makes audit preparation more challenging. Do you believe regulatory requirements are going to change to better accommodate the use of cloud services?
Oh boy, that's a difficult one. I don't think they're going to change to better accommodate. As a matter of fact, I think it's going to get more complex and more difficult for companies as we move forward to protect and to meet the never-ending change of new legal and regulatory requirements. You have to remember, when you move your data into the cloud, where's that data being stored? In many cases, it may be stored outside of your region, and you have a whole slew of additional requirements, especially as you start to move data over into the European Union, as I mentioned with some of the new privacy laws. So I don't see requirements changing to better accommodate cloud services. If anything, I see it being more difficult to be able to understand all of the various controls that you must end up being compliant to. So the impact is huge, but you do have associations that you need to be aware of. You've got associations like, let's say ISACA, okay, which was formerly the Information Systems Audit and Control Association. They can help you when it comes to compliance, preparation, and even communicating with your stakeholders, completing assessments internally so that you know that you have effective cloud computing services and that they're meeting your internal controls and security. So it's very important, one, to partner with organizations like ASACA, because by using various assessments and questionnaires that they can provide you, you're going to be able to identify internal control deficiencies within your organization, within your own data center, and within the cloud. And that's going to make it much more easier for you to then put in controls in place that will then meet those regulatory requirements.
That's a great advice, and I think even as you put in those controls, I want to go back to what you said before about having a single console or a single pane of glass in order to enforce some of those controls. So can you comment about the importance and the benefits of managing security policies from a single console? You talked about some of them before, but...
Yeah, I absolutely can. So first, I'll say that if you don't have a single console, what you're going to find, as I did touch on somewhat before, is that you're going to have inconsistent network configurations and policies across your enterprise organization. And it will catch up with you. It will end up as a control deficiency, whether it be an internal audit or an external audit. And by having these inconsistencies, you leave yourself more vulnerable to new threats. I mean, the threat landscape is changing constantly. At one point in time, I used to do a risk assessment on a quarterly basis, and then it went from quarterly to a monthly basis. But now we see the threat landscape changing daily. So it's important by having a single management council, because as you identify a new vulnerability, you're going to need to put in remediation plans, and having to do that multiple times through multiple councils is it's a huge investment. It's a huge investment on systems and tools and even with people. So by bringing that all down to a single council that can manage your policies, your configuration, assess the risk across your entire network, it's absolutely a huge cost savings. It's a time savings as well. Training becomes much easier because you now have a much smaller team that's going to be managing your network configurations across multiple technology providers, multiple cloud service providers. And even when something goes wrong, even from a perspective of troubleshooting, when you make a change, it's a single change, and that change can be then pushed throughout the entire network, versus working with multiple tools, multiple solutions, which, by the way, many companies are still doing today, and especially as they start to move into the cloud. Not everyone is choosing a single cloud service provider. You may have one business unit using Azure, another using Box or Dropbox or AWS, and having 3 or 4 different councils and configuration teams can be, one, confusing, inconsistent, and as I mentioned, it's a huge investment unless you're able to bring that to a single pane of glass and have a single team managing the entire security infrastructure.
Thank you, Maurice. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us and on your experience. I know that there's already questions for you from our audience, and we are going to get to Q&A after we proceed with our second part of the webinar. So Maurice is going to stay with us, and he's going to be able to answer your questions. You're welcome to click the questions button. If you do have a question, type that in. And like I said, after our next part of the webinar, we are going to go into Q&A, and Maurice will be able to answer your questions. Thank you very much, Maurice. This was great. A lot to think about, definitely. So we're ready to proceed with the next part of our webinar. And with us today is Ralph Buckrop of RWE Supply and Trading. RWE Supply and Trading is a leading